The courtroom was silent, save for the heavy thud of the gavel, a moment that shattered the air like glass. The accused, a well-dressed man, leaned forward, his trembling hands gripped the edge of the wooden table. His eyes darted nervously toward the jury. Everyone held their breath as the prosecutor stood and announced, "We have a confession." It wasn't just a statement, it was a bombshell, one that would change everything. The room held its collective breath, waiting for the next words to fall. "He did it," the prosecutor said, pointing toward the accused. It was a claim so bold, so damning, that the air seemed to crackle. The defense attorney, a seasoned figure with years of experience, was momentarily stunned, frozen in disbelief. How could this be? The case had just begun, and yet everything was already unraveling before their eyes. The atmosphere turned oppressive, filled with murmurs of disbelief and confusion. The walls of the courtroom, once towering with authority, now felt like they were closing in. The truth was a weapon, and it was about to be wielded with merciless precision. The room seemed to hold its breath as the accused's lawyer, realizing the magnitude of the situation, stood to speak. His voice shook, betraying the composed exterior he'd carefully maintained for years. "Your Honor," he said, his tone barely a whisper, "this is a grave mistake." The room remained silent as the lawyer paced, trying to regain his composure. The words felt hollow, futile against the growing evidence that now painted his client into an inescapable corner. He gestured toward the accused, hoping to garner some sympathy, but it was clear that the trust between them had been shattered. No one was willing to listen anymore. Everyone had already chosen sides. The courtroom buzzed with hushed whispers, the truth now something too dangerous to ignore. The lawyer's voice faltered as he appealed to the jury, but even he knew that the tide had already turned. No amount of argument could undo what had been done. The accused sat frozen, his mind racing through the moments that had led him here. His voice was low, almost broken, as he whispered to his attorney, "They've set me up." The words carried the weight of desperation and betrayal. Across the room, the prosecutor glanced at him with an expression that was part triumph, part challenge. The tension was unbearable, like a storm waiting to break. A single bead of sweat traced down the accused's temple, disappearing into the collar of his shirt. He shifted his gaze toward the jury, scanning their faces for any trace of doubt, but all he found were eyes hardened with suspicion. The silence pressed against his chest like a vice. Every sound, every movement in the room felt amplified, from the rustle of papers to the creak of the wooden benches. He knew in his bones that this was not just about the crime. It was about something bigger, something more dangerous than anyone dared to say aloud. The judge leaned forward, his aged face stern beneath the heavy light that poured from above. "Order in the court," he commanded, his voice deep and echoing. The sound cut through the tension, but did little to calm the unease gripping everyone. The wooden benches creaked as spectators shifted, straining to catch every detail. The defense attorney cleared his throat, trying to find footing in a battle already slipping away. The accused's eyes remained locked on the judge, searching for any sign of mercy in his expression. But mercy was a rare currency here, and the courtroom air was thick with unspoken judgments. The prosecutor shuffled their papers with precision, each movement deliberate, like a predator preparing to strike again. This was no ordinary case. Each second in this room felt like a chess move that could mean life or ruin. The silence cracked with the sound of the prosecutor's voice. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you will hear the truth," they began, their words slow and deliberate. Each syllable seemed to strike the air with finality. The accused flinched slightly, a subtle movement that did not go unnoticed. The defense attorney scribbled notes furiously, trying to counter an argument that had yet to be made. The jurors, tense and unmoving, leaned in as if bracing for a blow. The audience sat in a mix of dread and anticipation, aware they were witnessing the start of something irreversible. The prosecutor's gaze swept over the room, locking eyes with the accused for a brief, chilling moment before turning back to the jury. "And when you do, you will see why justice cannot be denied." The next morning, the courtroom air was colder, sharper. The accused sat in the same seat, but now his eyes carried a heavier shadow. The prosecutor methodically laid out photographs on the evidence table, each one a nail in the coffin. Murmurs rippled through the spectators, their whispers carrying suspicion. The defense attorney sat rigid, jaw clenched, as if bracing against an incoming storm. "Exhibit A," the prosecutor announced, holding up a single damning image. The jury leaned forward, curiosity and dread mixing in their expressions. The accused didn't look at the image. Instead, he stared at the floor, fighting to keep his breathing steady. Every heartbeat echoed like a drum beat in his ears. This wasn't just a case anymore. It was an assault on his very existence. The defense attorney rose slowly, each movement deliberate. His voice, though steady, carried an undercurrent of urgency. "We will show that this photograph proves nothing," he declared, holding the jury's gaze. But doubt was already a shadow creeping over their faces. The accused shifted in his seat, the chains of perception tightening invisibly around him. In the back row, a woman clutched her handbag tighter, eyes darting between the two lawyers. The judge sat like an immovable monument, hands folded, watching. This was no longer about truth. It was about who could bend it to their will. A sudden stir broke the courtroom's rhythm. An officer approached the prosecutor and whispered something urgent. The prosecutor's eyes flickered, then hardened. "Your Honor," he said, "a key witness has failed to appear." Gasps and murmurs spread instantly, like a wave crashing into stone. The defense attorney's eyes narrowed, sensing an opening. The accused finally looked up, his first glimmer of hope in days. The judge raised a hand for silence, his voice firm. "Proceed with what you have." The prosecutor nodded, but the subtle twitch at the corner of his mouth betrayed frustration. The missing witness was more than an inconvenience. It was a crack in the foundation of the prosecution's case. The defense attorney seized the moment. "Without this testimony," he argued, "the entire narrative collapses." The prosecutor countered swiftly, voice sharp, slicing through the murmurs. The judge's gavel came down once, the sound resonating like a warning shot. The accused leaned back, closing his eyes for a brief second, as though allowing himself to imagine freedom. But the reprieve was short-lived. The prosecutor was already shifting gears, preparing the next blow. The prosecutor stepped toward the jury box, a slow, deliberate movement that drew every eye. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "justice cannot wait for those who hide from it." His words hung in the air like smoke, curling into every corner of the room. The jury's eyes were locked on him, drawn by the steady cadence of his speech. The accused felt the weight return, pressing down heavier than before. This wasn't a fight over facts anymore. It was a battle for belief. And belief, once swayed, was nearly impossible to reclaim. The prosecutor's voice trembled for the first time as a sealed envelope was carried into the courtroom. The bailiff handed it to the judge, who studied it with an unreadable expression. "This changes everything," the judge murmured. The defense attorney leaned forward, eyes narrowing, sensing a shift. The accused's heart pounded, every second stretching into eternity. Whispers rippled through the spectators, their curiosity sharpening into something electric. The judge's gavel tapped lightly, commanding silence. "This evidence was not in the original file," he said, his voice low but heavy. The prosecutor's jaw tightened, as though calculating the cost of what was about to be revealed. The envelope's contents were laid on the evidence table. Photographs, time-stamped and clear. They showed the accused in a location far from the crime scene, the night it happened. The defense attorney rose, his voice sharp with new energy. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is proof." The jury's faces shifted. Doubt cracked the veneer of certainty. The prosecutor stepped forward, scanning the images with a guarded expression. He knew this wasn't over, but the tide had shifted. The accused exhaled slowly, tasting the first breath of hope in days. The prosecutor countered swiftly, voice rising. "Photos can be doctored," he said, pacing before the jury. His eyes locked on the defense attorney, daring him to object. The accused clenched his fists under the table, fury and fear swirling inside. The jury's expressions tightened, unsure of what to believe. The defense attorney's rebuttal came like a blade. These were authenticated by an independent lab. The tension surged, as if the air itself was waiting to shatter. The judge leaned forward. "Then we will hear from the lab technician," he said. The courtroom doors opened, revealing a woman in her late 30s, carrying a slim briefcase. Her expression was unreadable as she approached the witness stand. The prosecutor's eyes narrowed. This was not in his plan. The defense attorney's gaze was steady, his confidence unshaken. Every step she took seemed to echo louder, the weight of her testimony looming before a room holding its breath. On the stand, the technician adjusted the microphone. "These photographs are genuine," she stated, her voice calm but resonant. A murmur swept through the room like a sudden gust of wind. The accused's eyes closed for a second, relief flickering across his face. The prosecutor scribbled notes furiously, his jaw tense. The defense attorney stood tall, his hands clasped behind his back, savoring the moment. But beneath the victory, a silent question lingered. If the accused was elsewhere, then who committed the crime? The courtroom's atmosphere shifted to a volatile stillness as the judge called for the next witness. The prosecutor's tone was ice-edged as he summoned an officer to the stand. "Tell the court what you saw," he said. The officer, a tall man with a hardened gaze, began recounting the night in detail. Each word felt like a nail driven into the coffin of the accused. The defense attorney scribbled furiously, looking for cracks in the story. The accused sat motionless, jaw tight, a muscle twitching in his cheek. Every breath was a conscious act, as though exhaling too loudly might seal his fate. The defense attorney rose, his voice sharp with precision. "Officer, are you certain it was my client you saw?" The officer hesitated, just long enough for the room to notice. "Yes," he replied, but the conviction had thinned. A ripple of curiosity passed through the jury box. The accused's eyes flickered with a brief spark of hope. The prosecutor straightened, ready to intervene, but the judge's hand motion kept him silent. For the first time, the balance wavered in plain sight. The prosecutor pushed back, pacing slowly before the jury. "Doubt is the tool of the guilty," he said, voice rising with each step. He pointed directly at the accused, his eyes locked in a challenge. The defense attorney objected, but the judge allowed the statement. The accused clenched the edge of the table, knuckles whitening, the weight of the accusation pressing down harder than ever. The jury's faces hardened again, their earlier uncertainty fading under the prosecutor's relentless rhythm. The defense attorney countered, stepping into the open space between tables. His voice was measured, almost calm. "This is not a story of guilt, it's a story of assumption." He let the words hang, scanning the jury one by one. The prosecutor watched, jaw tight, resisting the urge to interrupt. The accused raised his head, locking eyes with a juror in the front row. For a moment, the connection was human, unfiltered by law or bias. It was a gamble, but in this room, gambles were all they had left. The judge's gavel struck once, echoing like a gunshot. "Enough," he declared, eyes sweeping the room. The tension was a living thing, coiling tighter with every second. Both attorneys returned to their seats, the silence heavier than any argument. The accused leaned back, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "Why so?" Outside the tall courtroom windows, clouds gathered, casting the chamber in a dim gray light. It felt as though the storm outside had seeped in, preparing to break. The courthouse steps were slick from a light drizzle as the defense attorney descended alone, head lowered. The crowd had thinned, but a few reporters lingered, their questions hanging unanswered. Inside, the accused sat in the holding room, staring at the cold concrete wall. His breathing was slow, measured, as though conserving strength for what lay ahead. A clock ticked overhead, each second dragging like a weight. The sound of a door unlocking broke the monotony. The attorney stepped inside, eyes heavy with unspoken news. "It's not over," he said quietly. But the words felt less like reassurance, and more like a warning. That night, the prosecutor sat in his office under the hum of a single desk lamp. Files were spread across the desk, photographs and transcripts overlapping in chaotic layers. His eyes lingered on a single page, an internal memo marked confidential. The edges of his mouth tightened. It wasn't just the case at stake now. It was his career, his reputation, his carefully constructed image. Outside, the city lights flickered in the wet streets. He took a slow breath and locked the memo in his desk drawer, sealing away the truth for now. The accused sister, a woman in her late 30s, arrived at the courthouse the next morning. Her eyes were red from sleeplessness, but her stride was steady. She approached the defense attorney in the hallway, her voice low and urgent. "There's something you don't know," she said, handing him an envelope. The attorney glanced at the contents, a grainy photograph, a name scrawled on the back. It wasn't proof yet, but it was a crack in the wall they'd been pushing against. The sister's voice trembled. "If you don't use this, they'll bury him." In court, the defense attorney rose with the envelope in hand. "Your Honor, we have new evidence." The prosecutor's head turned sharply, suspicion flashing in his eyes. The judge adjusted his glasses, nodding for him to proceed. The attorney placed the grainy photo on the evidence table. A murmur swept through the gallery. The image showed a figure leaving the crime scene, someone who was not the accused. The prosecutor leaned forward, scanning the picture, jaw tightening. The judge called for a recess. As the courtroom emptied, the accused remained seated, staring at the photograph now resting on the table before him. His pulse quickened, not from hope, but from recognition. He knew the man in the picture. And if the court found out who it was, the case would spiral into something far more dangerous. Outside the window, the drizzle had stopped, but dark clouds still clung to the horizon, promising more to come. The recess ended under a shroud of heavy silence. The defense attorney leaned toward the accused, voice low. "That man in the photo, do you know him?" The accused's jaw clenched before he whispered, "Yes, and you don't want to." The prosecutor glanced over, sensing the weight in their exchange. In the jury box, a woman tilted her head, eyes narrowing in curiosity. The judge returned to his seat, unaware of the undercurrent that had just shifted. Outside, thunder rumbled faintly, a warning that something darker was on the horizon. When court resumed, the prosecutor approached the bench. "Your Honor, this new evidence poses national security concerns," he said, voice carefully measured. The defense attorney's brow furrowed, realizing the case had just moved into dangerous territory. The judge's eyes narrowed. "Explain." But the prosecutor remained vague, citing classified details. The gallery buzzed with uneasy whispers. The accused kept his gaze fixed on the table, knowing that saying too much could be fatal, inside or outside the courthouse. The judge ordered both attorneys into his chambers. The gallery emptied, leaving the accused alone at the defense table. He ran a hand over his face, muttering under his breath. A court officer stood near the door, watching him with a wary expression. In the distance, muffled voices clashed behind the closed chamber door. The accused could feel the shift. This wasn't about proving guilt or innocence anymore. It was about control, about silencing the wrong truths before they saw daylight. Inside the judge's chambers, the conversation was sharp and clipped. "This is beyond the scope of this court," the prosecutor insisted. "It's still evidence," the defense attorney countered. The judge leaned back in his chair, weighing risks that went far beyond the case. Outside the door, the faint sound of rain began to patter against the glass, as though marking the countdown to an inevitable storm. The air felt dense, charged, as if one wrong sentence could bring everything crashing down. The attorneys returned to the courtroom with strained faces. The judge addressed the room. "Certain elements of this case will remain sealed." The jury exchanged glances, sensing something was being kept from them. The accused sat perfectly still, but inside, dread gnawed at him. The photograph lay face down on the table, as if hiding its own secrets. Outside, lightning split the sky, its flash briefly illuminating the stained glass behind the bench. The storm had arrived. The final day of the trial arrived with a cold gust of wind rattling the courthouse windows. The rain from the early morning had subsided, but a heavy gray sky still loomed overhead, as though the world outside was holding its breath. Inside, the air was thick with anticipation, charged like a live wire. The accused sat at the defense table, his eyes fixed on the closed door to the jury room, willing them to open. The gallery was filled with restless murmurs, reporters hunched over their notebooks, faces a mixture of exhaustion and hope. The defense attorney adjusted his tie, a small gesture that betrayed a flicker of nerves despite his otherwise composed demeanor. Across the aisle, the prosecutor shuffled through his papers, his focus unwavering. He seemed determined to remain unaffected, but his gaze occasionally flickered toward the defense table, where the accused sat motionless, a statue carved from tension. This was it. This was the moment that would decide everything. The accused had been through hell, and now there was no going back. The room fell silent as the judge's gavel echoed, marking the beginning of the end. The doors to the jury room opened, and the jurors filed in, their faces masks of uncertainty. The foreperson held a folded slip of paper, gripping it with both hands, as if it held the weight of the world. The room held its breath as the foreperson approached the judge. The accused's heart thudded in his chest, a dull drumbeat that echoed through the hollow spaces of his mind. The defense attorney sat tall, shoulders squared, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of anxiety. The prosecutor, his features cold and hard, stood with a quiet intensity, never breaking his gaze from the foreperson. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" the judge asked, his voice carrying the authority of a decision that would alter lives forever. The foreperson nodded, their face unreadable. "We have," they said. The words were simple, but their implications stretched out, rippling through the room like an earthquake ready to strike. The foreperson handed the slip of paper to the bailiff, who delivered it directly to the judge. The room fell silent. The judge unfolded the paper slowly, his face unreadable. He scanned the verdict, but there was a subtle shift in his demeanor, as though something in the words before him didn't align with what he had expected. The court held its collective breath, waiting for the judge to speak. "And?" After a long moment, the judge cleared his throat. "We find the defendant." He paused, his eyes narrowing slightly. The words on the paper had caught him off guard, and his hesitation was palpable. The prosecutor's gaze turned hard, his mouth tightening. The defense attorney leaned forward, sensing that something was wrong. The accused, sitting motionless at the table, felt a chill crawl down his spine. He had anticipated this moment, but the unknown verdict in the judge's hand now felt like a trap. The judge's voice echoed through the courtroom, heavy with finality. "Not guilty on all counts." The room exploded into a chorus of gasps, whispers, and disbelief. The accused's shoulders sagged, but the relief didn't come. He had won, but victory felt hollow. He looked at his defense attorney, but there was no triumph in their exchange, only a shared acknowledgement of the cost. The prosecutor's face was hard, a mask of controlled fury, but his clenched fists betrayed him. The gallery was a swirl of murmurs, shock, and confusion. The verdict had shattered everything. What had been black and white was now a swirl of gray. As the judge's gavel slammed down, sealing the fate of the case, the accused sat frozen, his mind racing. The victory had come at a cost he couldn't yet understand. As the courtroom emptied, the accused remained seated, his hands resting on the table in front of him. The photograph, now discarded and face down, lay there like a reminder of everything he had almost lost. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving the streets slick and glistening under a pale sky. The world felt different, like it had shifted on its axis, but the accused was still unsure if that shift was for better or for worse. The defense attorney approached him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You're free," he said, his voice quiet. The accused didn't reply. He simply stared at the photograph, his mind racing with the knowledge of who was behind it all. There were answers, yes, but they would come at a terrible price. The storm had passed, but the real fight was just beginning.